Happy Friday, uh, you, everybody. Um, TV class here, TVAC, moving along nicely. Sorry. I'll talk to you today about the Cosby Show. Again, one of the one of the drawbacks of doing this way is um, I'm gonna have to reiterate some of the things that we talked about in class on Wednesday. So those of you Wednesdayers, if any of you Wednesdayers are watching these videos in the first place, you're gonna hear some stuff again, but it's all worth hearing. So I think, well, not all. Sometimes I get lost. Um, so I'll start just by going through a lot of the stuff that we talked about on Wednesday. It sort of puts the whole this whole discussion into some perspective. We started talking about cancel culture and separating the art from the artist and trying to be mature enough and understanding that, you know, that me showing the Cosby Show shouldn't implicate me as a sexual predator or something like that. Or that I condone anything that Cosby does or did. But you guys should also feel comfortable talking about it, or having an opportunity at least to voice your opinions about Cosby and watching the show, and just all the complexities of this kind of discussion, right? And on Wednesday, I thought we had a really good dialogue about what it all entails. So, yeah, I don't want anyone to lump me in as a Cosby sympathizer or anything. I'm not. But his work is valuable. His art was exceptional. Um, it's hard to convey to you because it's a generational thing. Like, I grew up, like, I'm not gonna say idolizing the guy, but he was America's dad, like, legit. Like, people looked to him um, as that type of figure, especially with his show, the Cosby Show. And for you guys, he's just the creepy old rapey guy. You know, he's the monster. So there's that disconnect. And it's just, you wouldn't, this is the there's a couple things I use, like, when we talk about this kind of stuff. And one is, you wouldn't teach a history class and just ignore Hitler, right? Like, that's not a direct analogy, but you get the point. But I think more so the idea that I think it's just as bad to dismiss his art because of his actions as it is to dismiss his actions because of his fame, if that makes any sense, right? In our culture, it's like, oh, well, he's really famous, so we look the other way on some of this stuff. That's just as bad as saying, well, he did all these bad things, so his art shouldn't matter anymore. Like, we have to completely eradicate it. So, I want you guys always to feel comfortable expressing your opinions about this stuff and how you feel. And I completely understand if you didn't want to watch The Cosby Show. And as a point of emphasis, you didn't. I totally get that too. Uh, so, moving into the show itself, there's a lot of things that, I use the show as a platform to talk about social class, basically. We start with Ali G, right, and how he negotiates that space, and Cosby does it as well, in a very different, with a very different approach. So there's, I'll start with the criticisms of the Cosby Show when it came out. It started in 1984, so this is the 80s basically. Um, and there were two major criticisms of the show, and when I say them out loud, you're going to be like, "Wow, that's pretty racist to say." Um, One is this idea that you can't just make a black family white. Now, what does that imply? Well, that implies that success, what they're saying with the Cosby Show, is like this this isn't a black family. Like, completely sort of stripping it of its value by saying that. Like, making a black family white implies that success is a white attribute. That only white people can be successful in this way as doctors and lawyers and you know educated and wealthy people can only be white. That's basically what it says. Like, you just, yeah, this isn't gonna fly. It did fly, by the way. When I said Cosby was America's dad, I meant that. I didn't mean Black America's dad. I meant America's dad, like everybody. Um, and the second piece of criticism that the show took, it wasn't, I mean, it was obviously renowned. Like, everybody watched it, and it was sort of agreed upon, like, this is a really good show. But the critics were saying that, and they were also saying that it doesn't address the concerns of the African American community. Now, what does that mean? In 1984 speak, it means it doesn't talk about poverty, it doesn't talk about drug abuse, it doesn't talk about, thug life, it doesn't talk about teen pregnancy, it doesn't talk about all these kinds of things that stereotypes that served to, basically keep not just the African American community at arm's length and keep them down, but any communities of color or difference, right? Any marginalized group. So that kind of ties in with Lizzie's comment, and I'll be going back and forth between those two. Lizzie, you kind of point to it's a problem with any type of representation. When, Lizzie, you said, you basically said it doesn't address the concerns of the African American community in the 80s. But you were saying that toward a misunderstanding that uneducated viewers could watch it and be like, oh, racism's over. Very true. Like, I don't discount that at all. But that's not the job of the artist, right? To address, you can't play down to the lowest common denominator, right? Our country is only as strong as our most as our dumbest TV viewer, I guess, if that makes any sense. You can't play to that crowd, the crowd that's not going to get it or is going to misinterpret it and turn it into something negative no matter what you do. So I think that was Cosby's. I know it was Cosby's. Uh, his his plan, his intention was, I'm not going to give America the black family that they want, right? And the black family that they want was the kooky, um, entertaining, sort of, you know, yeah, like rappers, all the stereotypes. He didn't want to represent them and play up all the pre-existing negative stereotypes of the community. So he refused to give us the black family that we want, which is the one that we can safely set aside, right? It's no different than any marginalized group seeking representation in the media. You know, it's always for a white audience, or in this case, perfect example, like homosexuals on TV. I mean, you didn't see that really at all until the late '90s, um, with Will and Grace. You could say that, and they gave us Jack McFarlane, who was like the gay guy that we like, right? Super flamboyant and sassy and over the top and all this kind of stuff. And like, oh yeah, that's the gay guy. That's what gayness is. Um, it was the same thing with African Americans up until Cosby. Just give us the black guy that we like, the one that we can sort of feel better than and keep at arm's length. Um, so doesn't address the concerns of the community, and you can't just make a black family white. Like, and again, I think those are two really covertly racist statements and criticisms of the show. Um, and we'll be going back and forth between there. So concerning social class, like here's something that many of you who weren't in class on Wednesday didn't know. What you watched was the pilot. The pilot was pulled directly from Cosby's stand-up. Like most of the pilot episode in the series is based on his stand-up, and there are significant changes that occur between the pilot and the second episode and the rest of the series. And whenever there's big changes like that, it's always interesting to look and ask why they made those changes and for what reason, to serve what purpose. And these three changes, I think, make this show about class, like deliberately about class and understanding class structure and the significance of representation and things like that. So here's the three changes. They were made to look way more affluent in the rest of the series than in the pilot. The pilot, the house that they live in, it's pretty standard sitcom stuff. When the rest of the series, episode 2 till the end, the house was just, it was bigger, had tons, it was full of expensive furniture, very ornate things. It was decorated nicely. Cliff has his office in the basement. It's like a 4-story brownstone, in Brooklyn, and it's just, yeah, it was like, no, someone said we need to be upper class, not middle class, not, comfortable. Like, we need to be upper class. And that was huge. That was a big choice to so there was no misunderstanding that this family was not your typical, quote unquote, especially on TV, black family. Claire, the wife, the mother, her role significantly changes and marks, I think, um, the same ideas about class. She goes from, like, someone mentioned it. Was it Peter? Might have been Peter. Um, maybe I didn't. Whatever. Somebody mentioned her as she's very much the homemaker in the pilot, right? She's got the apron on. Maybe it was Tom, whatever. Wearing the apron the whole time, kind of like frazzled, screaming at the kids, speaking in Spanish to herself, you know, just sort of this worn out housewife in the kitchen, out of the kitchen, all that stuff. And they made a, a deliberate and blatant move away from that. Like they focused way more on the lawyer part, right? Um, for the rest of the series, and she's more in a power 80s like power suit than she is in her, just whatever, her apron and house clothes or whatever. And they shift the focus on her. Like she's a powerful, successful lawyer first and a mother homemaker second. And they definitely put Cliff and Claire on the equal playing field in terms of their authority and their relationship. There's very little there's very little distinction between, like, I'm the man of the house. There isn't much of that. That was refreshing and sort of groundbreaking in the 80s too. Um, so they made they made the family more affluent deliberately. They made Claire, they shifted the focus of Claire from housewife to lawyer significantly. And the third one is they added an older child. So if you remember the line where Cliff says, or she says, "Why do we have 4 children?" Cliff says, "Because we did not want 5." Well, they added a fifth for the rest of the series named Sandra. And for the first season or two, she's away at college. So you kind of see that rolling into this, you know, this move to, like, let's make it clear that we're holding our community, the country, to a higher standard. This is the bar now, especially for African Americans. Used to be down here, just getting out of the ghetto or whatever the stereotype was at the time. Now it's up here. And here's how you do it: the Cosby way, right? Education, family values, like all this kind of stuff. Here's what happens. Now they have this. Our daughter's at Princeton right now, and we have 4 kids that you can assume are going to do the same thing. And here's how you go about it. The Cosby Show is how you go about it. And it just brought a different sense of dignity to, a community that was short on dignity as a collective feeling in the 80s especially. And Theo, we'll get to that. Theo represents that very, very much so. So those 3 fundamental changes in the show from the pilot to the second episode, I think, point to a lot of this stuff. Like, this is our intent. This is our objective, is to change the way people think about social class and mobility and the African American community as a whole. So to the Theo, best scene in the pilot is the Monopoly money, right? The Cliff explaining to Theo life, basically. And it's, I mean, going back to these critics who are saying like it doesn't address the concerns of the African American community, and it's sort of like how can you watch it if you're not a complete racist? How can you watch it and not see that that entire scene with Theo and Cliff, father and son, isn't a metaphor for all of this stuff? Theo's a metaphor for both the critics and the stereotypical representations of people of color that many perpetuated and accepted as truth in America, right? So here you have like Theo basically saying, I just want to be a regular person. And Cosby's saying that's part of the problem is that our community and others, marginalized communities, have just sort of bought into or resigned themselves to believing that that's all that they can ever be. And we talk a lot about representation in TV class. And for a white male or for a white person, we don't get it because we've always seen whiteness in many forms on TV and in movies and all this stuff. People of color, marginalized groups have not. It's always been very limited representation. And those representations, for the large part, are negative or focus on, aspects of those communities that aren't necessarily valuable. So to see Cosby, right, the Cosby Show in 1984 was holy shit. Like, this is different. This is, again, I think Cosby's intent was to raise the bar for people. So Theo represents a the black community that has sort of resigned itself to being, lower class. Like, I just want to be a bus driver, and which is fine, but I think Cosby's initiatives were, if that's where you end up, you better end up there after trying as hard as you can to not end up there. You know what I'm saying? Because we are capable of more. And our culture has convinced us that we are not. Like, that's the fight that the Cosby Show fought every single week for 8 years or whatever it was. So that whole scene, right? And then Theo gives the impassioned response, like, just love me because I'm your son. And Cliff's like, fuck that, right? That is some bullshit that you've been fed. Like, you refuse to try because you're afraid to fail. You need to try as hard as you can. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard, right? That's the quote. And that scene is just, that's the show right there. Like, I think Cosby is speaking directly through, through this show. He's speaking directly to the community and saying, we're better than this, And so back to doesn't address the concerns of the African American community. Wouldn't you say that one of the concerns of the African American community is that they, they had been conditioned to settle for less than that of which they are capable? I think that's a major concern. So, And that the whole thing with this is regular people, right? Fucked. Like that's my little joke. Regular people are fucked. It's like set the bar up here. Let's get there. Here's how. Family values, education, right? They stress education all the way through. And it also shows just different ways to represent the culture, right? Um, the series is littered with appearances by black activists, appearances by black um, celebrities. There's African American art that you know is all over the house. Music, like all these, it celebrates these very positive things about the culture, and it doesn't punch you in the face with it to be like this is about race, this is about class. Like it doesn't do that. It's all in the subtext. It's all sort of we're supposed to eventually see it and absorb it, I guess. Um, so, okay. A lot of back to representation. Like it's easy when you're constantly seeing this is what you know on TV and in movies and on the news or whatever. It's like this is who you are, right? If you're black in this case, you're a thug. You're a you know you're a deadbeat. It's easy to just sort of resign yourself to those stereotypes when you're constantly inundated with them. And in the 80s, I mean, it's hard for you guys to, I think, make this connection because now there is more representation and people are more aware of it and concerned about it. They weren't in the 80s. So it's easy to sort of accept these stereotypes as truth and just be like, well, I'm black, so I guess I'm just going to be a bus driver or something. Like, that's all I'll ever be. Like, can that can wear you down mentally and emotionally. And it's it's a shame. It's still happening, but Cosby was like, here, do this, like, and I'm 100% aware of how creepy it is that he's a gynecologist in the show. It's so unfortunate. It's like, oh, why did you have to do that? It also says this, like, to the you can't just make a black family white criticism. It's like we're not doing that, but it makes this statement that black families are American families too. It's like, see, we struggle with the same things that white families do, or brown families do, or whatever, right? Kids bitching at each other, trying to, going to work and keeping the house up, and all the mundane bullshit of family life happens to everybody. I think that helped this show a great deal. Helped us to be like, oh, when we talk about America, it's not just white people. It's not just the people we see on TV. It's everyone is experiencing this shit. So I want to get into some of the comments. Some of the comments I liked. You guys got it. Summer's comment really hit me. It was a great point, right? Now, my response was, not only are they wealthy, they obtain their wealth, quote unquote, the right way. Because, yeah, emphasizing just how much the Cosby lifestyle was one to aspire to, right? But I think Cosby would say, I don't just want to be famous for being famous, right? Like, let's say it would have been easy and kind of a cop out to make Cosby like himself and like, oh, I'm a big celebrity, or I'm a big movie star, or whatever it is, or I'm a basketball player, or I'm a rapper, or whatever, right? Like, or I won the lottery or something, right? The how he got to be a doctor and marry a lawyer is important. How they got their wealth is important because they didn't take the easy way out, right? How they obtained their wealth is as important as them being wealthy in the show at all. Hard work, education, family values, perseverance, like all these kinds of things that, again, were not attached to the African American community at the time. You certainly, the culture wouldn't define them that way. Um, that was as important as them being upper class, was how they got there. Uh, it wasn't just a fluke, right? It wasn't just some, right? It was through these very um, traditional and honorable means, I guess. So that jumped out at me. And then, I addressed Lizzie's comment um, about how it can be misinterpreted, right? And that's always going to happen. And we talk about this a lot, but you can't play down to that segment of the audience that's going to misinterpret it. That's how you end up pandering. That's how you end up with a shitty show, is when you're just, you're playing down and assuming not assuming, expecting very little from your audience, and the art usually suffers as a result of that. So, Cosby Show was good. Let's just put it that way. Despite Cosby himself. I'm going to give you a bonus extra credit Easter egg word to use in a comment on this post to get extra points towards your final grade. Thank you for those of you. It's only so sad. There's only in this class, I think there's 4 or 5 of you who've put in the time. And trust me, you will be rewarded. This isn't just some fun little game. It is a fun little game, though. So, bonus word for this is, what is it? I don't know. Just comment on the video. Comment on this post. And I know I need a word. Use the word fabric. Use the word fabric. And win. I'll see you guys.